Welcome everyone to the 2025 Arlin M. Adams Lecture in Law, Religion, and the First Amendment. Everyone feels like they're in the right room, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I think I know most of the people who are here, but in case there's some of you who we have not had a chance to meet before, my name is Sophia Lee, and I'm a longtime member of the faculty here at the law school and the dean of the law school for the last 2+ years. We are, I just want to say, so fortunate to have with us today the esteemed scholar John Fabian Witt. Apart from being a fellow legal historian and a friend, I have to say his newest book has many illuminating contributions to the subjects that I've covered in my own scholarship. So I have been really looking forward to this lecture personally with great enthusiasm. But rather than gush here myself about what you're all in store for, I'm going to leave a full introduction of Professor Witt to my colleague Serena Mayeri, who holds the Arlin M. Adams Chair here at the law school and was instrumental to organizing today's lecture. But before I do that, I wanted to say a bit more about this lecture series and about Judge Adams himself. So this lectureship was made possible by a generous gift to the law school from Nasa Adams, which was given in memory of her husband, the Honorable Arlin M. Adams. And Judge Adams was a 1947 graduate of the law school and a 1998 recipient of an honorary degree, a Doctor of Laws degree from Penn. He's a native Philadelphian and served for nearly 60 years as a lawyer, judge, and mediator in the local legal community. He was twice considered for a seat on the United States Supreme Court and was nominated to the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in 1969, where he served until his retirement from the bench in 1987. In a point of personal connection, during his time on the Third Circuit, he authored an oft-discussed opinion in employment law, which is the course that I taught here at the law school, and we would regularly discuss. So I feel like it's exciting to think about the connection to that particular case and its author. He was also a member and former chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association, a past president of the American Philosophical Society, a Penn trustee, a chair of what is now the law school's Board of Advisors, and the former chair of the U.S. Supreme Court's Judicial Fellows Commission. In preparing for this lecture, I had the pleasure of listening to a 1999 oral history interview of Judge Adams that was conducted by our colleague Sally Gordon, who is right here. There we go. And I have to say, first of all, I recommend it to everyone. But she was the perfect interviewer for this conversation because she clerked for Judge Adams from 1986 to 87 and became the inaugural holder of the Adams Chair here at the law school. And in their interview, Judge Adams described his time as a student here as the greatest intellectual experience that I ever had. Any of our alums and or students in the room, I hope someday you will look back on this time and feel similarly about it. He was particularly close to the dean at the time, who was Edwin R. Keedy, which again is a familiar name to anybody who's been here during the time in which we have had our moot court competition named after Dean Keedy. So on learning that the recently graduated Adams could not afford a suit, Dean Keedy bought him one to wear on his first day as a freshly minted attorney at Schneider, Harrison, Siegel, and Lewis. So his, I think his affinity to the law school stretched as well to the way he felt that the law school had helped him out early in his career. A brilliant lawyer and an amazing intellect, Judge Adams also taught for many years here at the law school. In the mid-1970s, he told the then Dean Lewis Pollack that the material in his First Amendment seminar was too vast for one course and would need to be split in two. I think he assumed that he would get to take the speech and press clauses part of this new bifurcated course. But Dean Pollack agreed that a split should happen, but instead told him to take the religion clauses portion of the course. When Judge Adams objected that there wasn't even a textbook for this, Dean Pollack replied, "Then write one." I like that. So I'm going to try that line if anybody objects to anything I ask them to do. And that is exactly what Judge Adams did. He really left in his time an indelible mark on the law school and on this university. He received the Alumni Award of Merit from the university in 1994, the Law School's Distinguished Service Award in 1981, and its James Wilson Award in 2001. So it's an absolute privilege for us to continue to honor him, including through this distinguished lecture series. Now, the first lecture was held in 2020, and that was when Princeton's president, Chris Eisgruber, spoke on free speech and inclusivity on college campuses. My thanks, I just want to say quickly, to everyone who made today's lecture possible, and especially to Carlin Miller. That's why I'm looking over your direction, Carlin, who leads our amazing conferences and events team here at the law school. I'm also deeply grateful to Professor Witt for being here and for sharing his time and insights with us. I also want to extend a special welcome to Peter Marvin, who is a 1972 law school graduate who clerked for Judge Adams and remains close with the Adams family today. So thank you so much for being here with us. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Mayeri to introduce our 2025 Adams lecturer, Professor John Fabian Witt. And you all are about to be in for a real treat getting to hear from him later.
So it's my very great pleasure and privilege to introduce John Fabian Witt, who is the Alan H. Duffy Class of 1960 professor at Yale Law School. He received his JD and PhD in history from Yale and has also taught at Columbia and Harvard Law Schools. But his roots are actually here in Philadelphia, so it's wonderful to welcome him back home. John is the author of several earlier prize-winning and very different books that display a really remarkable range of both epics and topics. His first book, The Accidental Republic, Crippled Working Men, Destitute Widows, and the Remaking of American Law, came out in 2004, followed soon thereafter by Patriots and Cosmopolitans, Hidden Histories of American Law in 2007. He's also the author of Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, which won the Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's received many other honors, too numerous to name, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. And he is also the author, in addition to a couple of books I haven't mentioned, of 2 open source tort case books, one with our colleague Karen Tund. In addition to all of this, he teaches annually in the Warrior Scholar Project academic boot camp for enlisted veterans and has launched a course on the history of the U.S. Constitution for secondary school teachers and educators through the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale. So I've known John since the late 20th century, when he was a teaching assistant in my constitutional law small group class. I'll never forget his feedback on my first legal memo, which appropriately was about the outer limits of the First Amendment. With a year of history grad school under my belt, it was my first foray into legal writing. And John said so kindly that my memo on fighting words was great if I had been writing a narrative history or a journalistic account of the law's development across time. He explained that a legal memo was a different genre, a statement of what the law is today in the present moment. For these purposes, he said, the context and evolution of the law over time was mostly irrelevant, and short, straightforward sentences followed by citations to cases rather than artful prose were at a premium. The most important thing he said, though, was that although law school is about learning how to think and to write like a lawyer, the ability not to write like a lawyer was even more important to preserve, and that I should do whatever I could to make sure not to lose that historian's voice or my own voice in law school. It was the first of many occasions in which John offered wise and valuable counsel, and it was also a really deeply affirming thing to be told as a very uncertain 1L. John has shown again and again that in his years as a lawyer and legal scholar, he has honed all of these virtues as a teacher and mentor worthy of Judge Adams's legacy, as a compelling historian and chronicler of the past who captures its characters in all of their human complexity, and whose work speaks powerfully, as we're going to hear, to and resonates in the present day. And nowhere is that more true than in his latest, truly magnificent book, The Radical Fund, How a Band of Visionaries and $1 Million Upended America. John, we're so delighted and grateful to have you with us and really look forward to your talk.
It is a real pleasure to be back in Philadelphia, where I grew up. As Sophia and Serena have said, I see a lot of familiar faces, good friends, co-authors, former students, former teachers. It's a great moment to be back in Philadelphia. Also, a difficult moment in the history of the Republic. A republic that started here in Philadelphia, as you all know. And it's an honor to give the Arlin Adams Lecture, which is, I hope, over the course of the next hour, an opportunity for us to talk about some of the ways in which the United States that we know has been produced, and many of the institutions that it produced in the 20th century have started to come undone in a variety of ways. The way I want to leap into that story is to talk to you about a different window, a different lens for thinking about the liberalism of the American Republic of the 20th century, pieces of which are coming apart around us. And that's the story of this funny organization called the Garland Fund, which I'll introduce in a moment, but I thought I'd say a word about why it might be worth talking about it right now. The Garland Fund is a funny amalgam, as I'll describe, of a series of social mobilizations, social formations, social movements that came to constitute the liberal state of the middle of the 20th century. Let's take three particular social formations in particular. One, a social formation around labor and class and industrial labor unions. Two, a social formation around civil rights movement and around Black liberation. Three, a movement for civil liberties. And those three projects, in complicated tension with one another, sometimes cooperation with one another, sometimes bickering with one another, helped to form the foundations of the mid-20th century state. And so it was a great discovery for me in the archives a decade and a half ago to start to realize that a foundation that existed for 20 years, from 1922 to 1941, had in early stages each one of those three social formations around a common table, talking to one another, and producing some of the syntheses and disagreements, cooperations and bickerings that are characteristic of the mid-20th century liberal state. So that's the story I want to tell you about. I'm going to start off by describing the fund and its origins, trying to make a comparison to our world today, go through the story, and then come back around at the end of our conversation to thinking about some of the resonances, what some of the resonances might mean for the 2020s. So what is this funny organization? Let's start at the end of the 1910s. And here's an opportunity to think about some of the resonances between our moment and the moment a century ago. It's a moment of nationalist reaction against a set of global adventures of armed force that had become deeply unpopular, a moment of rejection of people thought of as from afar, from abroad, a moment of things like ideological deportations of people who are thought to be representing foreign and dangerous elements. It's a moment of surging white nationalism, that is the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, the so-called Second Klan. It's a moment of imprisoned presidential candidates, Eugene Victor Debs, who runs for president in 1920 from a prison cell and gets 1 million votes in the election of 1920. It's an era of labor unions in decline and on the run, a strike wave in 1919 that produces employer shock troops who fight back against labor unions and crush almost all the strikes that happen in the wake of World War I, which were an effort to retain the gains earned by labor during the course of the war. It's an era of huge inequality. This is a curve you may have seen, the famous U-shaped curve of Thomas Piketty, the economist who studies inequality over time in Western capitalisms. And this is American income inequality. You can see that the 1920s look a whole lot like the 2020s. It's a moment, too, of propaganda and misinformation in American democracy, a moment when the war set off a series of propaganda campaigns that showed people all over the Atlantic world, the power of propaganda to shape the way people thought, propaganda that characterized certain people as other and managed to transform. I mean, think of the propaganda effort required in the United States to allow Woodrow Wilson to run for president in 1916 as the president who kept America out of the war, and then be in favor of and support a war declaration in April of the next year. And turn the country on a pivot from anti-war to pro-war. So the power of propaganda is on the minds of Americans at the end of World War I. And it's an America in which the presidential candidate who wins that 1920 election, Warren Harding, runs on a platform of returning America to normalcy, restoring American normalcy, making America normal again, or great again, in a way that imagines, with the immigration reforms that are about to happen, that imagines an America of several decades before. The quota system built in the early 20s models itself on 1890 America. So all sorts of resonances between their world a century ago and ours now. And into this world of 1920 America comes this young, confused, not especially special man. A man named Charles Garland, who's a Harvard undergraduate in the process of dropping out, some combination of confusion and early onset of mental illnesses that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And in 1920, when he turns 21, he inherited $1 million. It was the leftover estate from his grandfather, who'd been an investment banker during World War, had been the son of a shoemaker in Philadelphia, actually, not far from here, who becomes an investment banker, a partner of Jay Cooke, doing Civil War war bonds, and then eventually an early founder of a bank that becomes part of the Citigroup empire today. The grandfather passes on a fortune to a playboy middle generation that almost spends it all, but fails to spend all of it, such that in 1920, young Garland inherits his $1 million, and he announces that he doesn't want it. He doesn't want it. He didn't earn it. He doesn't deserve it. He's been reading the New Testament. He thinks that Jesus wouldn't have taken it. He tells the press this. He's been reading H.G. Wells, the socialist and science fiction writer, and he thinks that it's not consistent with the incipient socialism that he's thinking about adopting. Garland is no hero in any of this. He has a series of trusts that he can't alienate, that he's stuck with, and he has an income that supports him across the rest of his life, which turns out in some ways to be a curse rather than a benefit, or maybe at least both. He ends up being someone who is victimized by parasites throughout the course of his life because he has this money, and so people glom onto him, and maybe we can come back to that after the lecture and questions and answers. But when Garland inherits this money, the press, the society pages, descend on the Cape Cod farm that is his mother's. He is handsome. His young wife is a debutante who is also beautiful. They have a young child. The story seems delicious. It is too good not to tell in the society pages from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Los Angeles. And the stories are all over the news. This is just a tiny sample of the headlines that appear all over America for years because the story is just too good to stop telling. The result of this is at least a number of things. One is young Charles is sick of the press on his lawn, and the other is that this man, Upton Sinclair, whom you may have heard of, in Pasadena, reads the story. And Upton Sinclair, who in 1906 writes a novel called The Jungle, which is a muckraking novel about the slaughterhouses and the meatpacking industry of Chicago, Sinclair reads the story and reaches out to young Garland and says, Charles, you think you pulled off a stunt. I am a better stunt man than you I know how to pull off a stunt, and the thing to do is not to refuse this money, it's to accept it and give it to me. And I will give it away and do good things with it. It turns out that Sinclair is not organized enough. He's an iconoclast and a stuntman, but he's not an organization, and he's not organized enough to pull off the project of creating a foundation. So he pulls in someone who is one of the leading organization men of the first half of the 20th century, well into the second half, a man named Roger Baldwin, who in the same year that Garland inherits the money, has founded the American Civil Liberties Union in New York City. As it happens, Baldwin and Garland are connected through family connections of a variety of kinds. Baldwin is connected to almost everyone on the East Coast in the 1920s. It's part of his genius. And so Sinclair persuades Garland to give Baldwin the money, and Baldwin then sets up an organization known as the American Fund for Public Service, incorporated in Delaware, where all corporations are incorporated in 1922. New York State refuses to incorporate the fund as a group of radicals. And what Baldwin does is assemble a board of directors to administer a foundation, a spend-down foundation that will have as its project spending Garland's money as fast as it can. He assembles a group organized around labor leaders like Sidney Hillman and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, civil rights figures like James Weldon Johnson, who is the first black director of the NAACP, has been in that post for 2 or 3 years when this fund comes along. It includes eclectic leftists like Scott Nearing, fired by this university as an economist, and then on the foundation board. It includes Frida Kirchwey, who's the editor-in-chief of The Nation magazine, eventually the owner of The Nation magazine. This is Norman Thomas, who will run for president on the Socialist Party ticket after Eugene Debs is done running for president. It includes one member of the Communist Party at a time. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but one member at a time. This is one of the members, Clarina Michelson, who's on later. And the labor leader, the labor lawyer, Morris Ernst. There are on the foundation's board about a dozen people at any time. But the world of the fund is much bigger than just its foundation board. It includes intellectuals like Walter Lippmann and John Dewey here, who serve on committees for the fund and are influential intellectual figures in the world of the fund. It includes lawyers like Clarence Darrow and Felix Frankfurter, who represent fund beneficiaries and are outside advisors. It includes literary figures like Alain Locke, Max Eastman, Crystal Eastman. It's a world of Margaret Sanger. It's a world of civil rights figures like Charles Hamilton Houston, Walter White, and W.E.B. Du Bois, all of whom are participating in conversations, seeking funds from the foundation. And a new generation, once we get to the early 30s, of civil rights folks, people like Pauli Murray and A. Philip Randolph. At the core of the foundation was a group of labor organizers from groups like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and in particular, a group of labor intellectuals, technocrats, who around a variety of now forgotten institutions helped to design and craft the industrial union as a force in American capitalism, which would become in the 1930s the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which you now know as part of the AFL-CIO configuration. And the CIO would be the central industrial unit of the New Deal coalition. And the brain trust of the CIO in the 30s is beginning in the 20s to organize itself around the fund, around the world of the fund, and around institutions that the fund helped to stand up. The project of the foundation had, as I said, at least 3 core features. 1, the Industrial Union, 2, a Black Emancipation Project, and 3, a Civil Liberties Project. I want to say a word now about the kind of Civil Liberties Project that the fund had in mind. The fund is run by Baldwin. Baldwin is the central figure throughout its life, and he is famous for running the ACLU during this period, which he founded at the same time. And the ACLU is a paradigmatic rights organization. It is, in its moment, pushing for labor rights in particular, and as the brilliant work of Laura Weinrib at Harvard Law School has shown, is transitioning to a kind of neutral posture, ostensibly neutral posture, in which it's defending the rights of all. Many have critiqued the ACLU, and still do today, for its rights focus. I think the first couple decades of the ACLU we should rethink, because the ACLU was not an organization just doing rights. It was an organization paired with the Garland Fund, and Baldwin is running both. If we focus on the history of the ACLU, you'll see just one side of its story. Really what it is an organization doing two things: pushing rights through the ACLU and doing affirmative projects of labor organizing and supporting speech efforts and supporting discourse and supporting interventions into democratic discourse through the Garland Fund's money on the other. The Garland Fund stands up a publishing house. It creates a news syndication service to put out labor news into the world. It publishes magazines, supports newspapers, and as I'll say in a few moments, supports an entire labor education project that is the way that the industrial union organizes itself in the lean years, the backward years for labor of the 1920s. A lot of this work comes out of Walter Lippmann's immediate post-war writings. These are writings that may be familiar to some of you, great books that are still worth reading today, like his public opinion book in 1922, or I think even better, Liberty and the News, published right after the war in 1919, in which Lippmann's observation is that the American press, the media, stands in between the voter and the world. Lippmann's idea in public opinion, put most famously, is that the pictures in our heads depart from the world outside. And it's the media that stands in between. This is the beginning of the study of the modern media and democratic theory and Lippmann's engagement with this problem right after the war. And the project of the fund, there right next to the ACLU, is to intervene in that project of producing democratic information as best it can. The project was to free people's minds from the bonds of old institutions, of which they had a number of targets in mind. Through the 1920s, many of the causes that you might associate with progressivism, liberalism, left politics of the 1920s run through the projects of the fund. The late 1922 ad campaign run by the NAACP as part of its anti-lynching efforts is supported by the fund. This is an ad campaign conceived of by James Weldon Johnson, but in cahoots with Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew twice over, who is becoming Madison Avenue's chief ad man. And the fund pays for Bernays and Johnson together to produce this famous ad campaign of full-page newspaper ads published all around the country, including in Atlanta, which was no small thing in 1922. It comes at the tail end of Johnson's efforts to push anti-lynching legislation through the Congress, an effort that fails in the Congress, but then produces, to Johnson and Du Bois's mind, remarkable successes in the campaign for public opinion, largely around these ads. The cases cause celebs of the 20s, like the defense of Ossian Sweet, black doctor in Detroit who moves into a white neighborhood and is then prosecuted for murder when he's defending his family against a white riot on his front lawn. Clarence Darrow represents Ossian Sweet and his family at trial. Then the trial is quietly paid for by the fund. The Scopes trial that happens the same year as the Sweet case in Detroit, the Scopes case in Dayton, Tennessee, famously sponsored by the ACLU, but that's Garland Fund money doing the work. William Jennings Bryan here alongside Clarence Darrow. Bryan is the person who fired James Weldon Johnson from the State Department. So it's a small kind of small world in a variety of ways. The Sacco and Vanzetti campaign is supported, especially in its early days, by the foundation. The foundation is connected to Sacco and Vanzetti through Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the board members of the foundation, whose longtime lover is a man named Carlo Tresca, who's an Italian anarchist, and so connects the foundation to the underworld of Italian anarchists in Boston, from which Sacco and Vanzetti come. And that's a nearly decade-long campaign to defend Sacco and Vanzetti from the electric chair, which fails in 1927, but organizes much of the left through these years. So in some sense, many of the most famous public campaigns that make it down to us in the period run through the table at the foundation. But there's a quieter legacy of the foundation, one that I'm almost certain you haven't heard of, that I think is the center of the foundation's work. I should confess, and there are some of you in this audience who know this book took me a very long time to construct, a very long time. And part of the reason for it was that it was hard to figure out how to narrate all of the different pieces of this story. How do you narrate a story that has the anti-lynching campaign and Ossian Suite and the Sackler and Vanzetti, and the Scopes trial? It doesn't make sense. And the story came together for me around a little labor college in the Hudson Valley of New York, a place called Brookwood Labor College in Katona, New York. So it's fancy neighborhood for a labor college, honestly. It's not there anymore. It operates from 1921 to 1937. A word later on why it closes. And Brookwood Labor College in this mansion is run by a man named A.J. Musty. And A.J. Musty, known maybe to some of you as a anti-Vietnam War protester, he's one of the great nonviolent protest leaders of the 20th century. His work is an inspiration to people like Bayard Rustin, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. And in the 20s, what Musty does during a lean period for left politics is establish Brookwood Labor College. Brookwood Labor College is the institution that is the single institution that receives the most funding from this foundation of anyone. And what it does is, for a decade and a half, train cadres of labor organizers in the industrial union project. Musty's goal is to bring to American capitalism industrial democracy, to create a world in which workers not only have better wages through collective bargaining, but have a say in the structure, in the governance, in the organization of their work lives. And during the moment in which labor unions are back on their heels, labor organizers come to Brookwood, come to Katona, New York, and train and talk and learn organizing strategies. They are from a wild array of different kinds of labor unions. They are the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, unions which are anticipating some of the cross-racial union organizing efforts that will break out in the 30s and into the 40s. But they are also some of the all-white unions that have Jim Crow charters built into their central organizing structure. The Railroad Brotherhoods, famously all-white, hold summer camps at Brookwood. And Brookwood is trying to figure out, and Musty is trying to figure out, how to organize these different constituencies, these different coalitions, into a labor movement for American capitalism. The Brookwood Project helps to produce new ideas for the brain trust of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America in particular. And Sidney Hillman, the organizer and the leader of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, who is a member of the founding board of the Garland Fund, may be the most important institutional figure in the Garland Fund's 20-year life. I mean, Baldwin is the organizing person, but Baldwin's vision, Baldwin's not a vision guy, he's an organizing guy. Hillman supplies the vision. Hillman's vision is the project of an industrial union, and he quickly steps down from the Garland Fund board. He's a busy, busy man. But he places his lieutenants on the board, and it's Hillman's influence that leads to Brookwood being the chief beneficiary of the fund across the decade and a half of Brookwood's existence. And it's Hillman's influence that helps eventually bring the Brookwood spirit to what becomes the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. Hillman is Roosevelt's right-hand man in the labor union world. When Roosevelt's making hard decisions in the late 30s and early 40s, he says famously, a phrase that is used in ricochets around America, he says, "Clear it with Sidney, clear it with Sidney." And so this Russian Jewish immigrant of the 19aughts, who goes through the Garland Fund and helps to finance and inspire Brookwood, becomes a leading figure in the New Deal coalition. Alongside the industrial labor union through Brookwood, the Garland Fund early on gets involved in the study of black education. In 1924, Du Bois and Johnson go to the fund. I should say you should sense an awkwardness in that phrase, because Johnson is the fund. So Du Bois and Johnson go to the fund, except Johnson is asking for a grant for himself from the board on which he serves. There is inside dealing all over this foundation. The former dean of Columbia Law School, who's a tax nonprofit specialist, is especially concerned about this on my behalf. He says there's inside dealing and self-dealing all over. You need to be careful of this outfit. So their internal governance structure was complicated. Actually, there's some virtues to this too, because they were giving money to things they knew about. But in any event, Du Bois and Johnson come to the fund and ask for a grant to study black schools in the American South. And this launches a set of empirical investigations into funding inequalities in states across the South that is both a numerical, empirical investigation and a set of photographs taken. This photograph is by Horace Mann Bond, one of the great students of black education, participants in black education in the 1920s. And when Du Bois spearheading this particular fund grant application, Du Bois organizes this fund grant in a very interesting way. He organizes it around the idea that in order to organize across class, the American labor movement is going to have to include black workers. The Great Migration is underway. World War I has helped to touch that off. And the idea that black workers will have to be included in any industrial union project is something that Du Bois seizes on, in part for strategic reasons. He knows that's what this board wants to hear. And so that's a good way to get this board to give him the grant. But it's the beginning of a conversation that will last across the course of the 1920s and help influence the future of the NAACP's projects and also the course of the fund's grant giving. By 1929, 1930, the Garland Fund will receive from the same team, Du Bois and Johnson, now with Walter Witt added in, a request for funding for a bigger project, one that comes out of the study of black schools in 24 and 25, one that sponsored a whole series of articles published in The Crisis, Du Bois's magazine, across the middle and latter part of the 1920s. And in 29, Johnson and Du Bois and Witt come to the fund and say, let's take our studies of the empirical inequality, the funding, the gross funding inequalities that we've documented in Southern schools, and let's use that foundation, that empirical foundation, as a launching pad for a set of lawsuits to push equalization on Jim Crow schools in the South. The fund's money ends up supplying the first NAACP Garland Fund salary to Charles Hamilton Houston, here on your left, and Thurgood Marshall there on your right in the 1930s. And they will famously lead the litigation campaign that, starting in the late 30s at the U.S. Supreme Court, starts to produce the first cases on what we will now think of, looking backwards, as the road to Brown against Board of Education. I want to spend a moment, though, on this other character in the 1929, 1930, 31 moment, and that's this fellow here in the front, Nathan Margold. Here he is at the NAACP conference in 1932. It may be that my favorite photograph in this book, the book is full of photographs. In fact, I shouldn't tell you, if you just read the captions to the photographs, you get the whole story. There's a lot of words in this book, but the captions to the photographs give you the whole story. But it may be that the two women behind Margold are my favorite faces in the whole book. Especially the woman on your left. She has a sense of, who is this guy in front of me? Well, let me tell you who this guy in front of her is. Nathan Margold's a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant to the United States. He, like many characters in this book, went to City College, the Harvard of the proletariat in New York. He goes from City College to Harvard Law School, where he understands himself to be replicating the path of Felix Frankfurter before him. City College, Jewish immigrant, City College, Harvard Law School. And Frankfurter, connected to the fund, is on the Harvard faculty, and Frankfurter identifies in Margold, as he did in so many of his students, a future protege, someone to mentor, someone to extend Frankfurter's sphere of influence. Margold, not quite as charismatic, not quite as forceful as some of Frankfurter's happy hot dogs, the young Frankfurter students who went into the New Deal in later years. And so Frankfurter identifies Margold as a future academic, as someone to join the Harvard Law School faculty along with him. And in 1927-28, Margold visits the Harvard Law School. It goes swimmingly. The Harvard Law School votes Margold an offer. The president of Harvard University, though, says, we already have Frankfurter. We have one Jew on the Harvard Law School faculty. I don't want to. And rejects Margold. And Margold, it causes a whole a scandal on the Harvard Law School faculty. There are emergency faculty meetings. Frankfurter is outraged. Everything is memorialized very usefully for the future historian. Everything is memorialized and written down. But they can't get Margold his job back. So what Frankfurter then does is connect Margold to a legal project representing Pueblo people in the American Southwest. Margold spends a year and a half doing work on behalf of Native American land claims. And then in 1929, as the Johnson-Du Bois project for an anti-Jim Crow litigation campaign comes to the Garland Fund, there's Frankfurter to connect his not sufficiently well-employed former student and protege to this project. And so Margold becomes the first of several architects of an NAACP litigation campaign. The book tries to suggest that Margold brings his distinctive experience in the Southwest to the project of designing the anti-Jim Crow litigation campaign, and that in particular, Margold's influenced by an idea that he sees in the Southwest. The problem for Native peoples in the Southwest, he says, is not that they lack rights. It's not that they lack rights. The problem is that those rights are systematically violated by an administrative structure and an administration of power and a managerial structure, federal officials in particular, such that those rights are meaningless. And he takes that idea, that the project for the NAACP Garland Fund campaign should be a management one. It should be one about reorganizing power in the American South rather than one about reorganizing rights. And that's the central Margold idea in those early years. The project of industrial unionism is what brings the Garland Fund to its anti-Jim Crow project. It's what makes that project appealing. I told you that Du Bois's early effort to get the Garland Fund to subsidize the studies of Black education lead with the idea that industrial union organizing will require cross-race organizing. And that continues through into the 1929, 1930, 1931 moment of the anti-Jim Crow litigation campaign that Margold, along with Witt and Du Bois and Houston, and at that point, Johnson helped to stand up. There is always, though, a tension. The tension is that those all-white labor unions I told you about, they are still crucial participants in this Garland Fund world, in the coalition organized around Brookwood Labor College. So one of the most interesting strands to follow in this story is the question in the 1930 moment of whether in launching this campaign to make labor unions part of the target, or instead to isolate the fire of the litigation campaign against Jim Crow in the South in its state formations. We can see even in the early Margold efforts to design a litigation blueprint, the remaining idea, the residual idea of suing white labor unions. That, though, falls out of the NAACP's project in order to maintain the coalition with industrial labor unions. And maybe we can come back I think, Charles Hamilton Houston resumes that project of suing the labor unions once he leaves the NAACP, once he's no longer bound by the coalitional imperatives of staying together with the NAACP's labor allies. And that culminates in a case that should be more famous out in the world, although thanks to Dean Sophia Lee and others, is famous in places like this, a case called Steele against Nashville and Louisville Railroad, 1944, in which the Supreme Court vindicates the representation claims, although not the membership claims, of black railroad workers under the Wagner Act. We can come back to that. It's a little bit in the weeds. We can come back to that afterwards. This picture, though, signals what happens to the Garland Fund once the 1920s have come to an end. 1929 is the crash, is both a moment in which the NAACP is designing its Garland Fund-supported litigation campaign and the moment in which the crash on the stock exchange brings an end to the Garland Fund's assets. The Garland Fund started with $1 million. During the course of the 1920s, that $1 million invested in shares in the First National Bank of New York, which was Garland's grandfather's bank. doubles, such that the Garland Fund gives away across the course of its life $2 million, having been given one. If you wanted to scale that, $2 million in index for inflation, it's about $40 million today. That's a lot, but you shouldn't be impressed. If you want to launch national social movements, $40 million is not going to launch national social movements. You might add an additional piece to get a sense of what that means. If you were to then scale it to the size of our economy today, that is, you wanted to know, like, well, what kind of contribution to the world can you make with this $40 million if the economy were much smaller, you might get to something like $800 million. So think of this foundation as having given away in sort of impact, in an impact sense, little less than $1 billion over the course of 20 years. Well, now we're talking about a decent amount of money. Still nothing like the fortunes that our oligarch overlords are giving away in their giving campaigns, but a decent amount. So the money comes crashing down in 1929 with the crash, and an irony then ensues. The work that the foundation had done, the work that the world of the foundation had done, the social movements like the industrial unions and the NAACP, and an array of civil rights unions like the unions run by A. Philip Randolph. I can't believe I haven't talked about A. Philip Randolph until this point in this lecture. A. Philip Randolph is part of the world of the fund in the 1920s. He is a black socialist as part of a world of radical Harlem in the early 1920s. He's a migrant from Jacksonville, Florida, to New York in 1911 or so is when he arrives. He too is a City College graduate. The Harvard of the proletariat is A. Philip Randolph's Harvard too. And A. Philip Randolph is one of the crucial figures in persuading the fund that working on labor unions can also mean working with black organizations. He's going to help stand up the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters starting in 1925 using grants from the fund. There's a way in which A. Philip Randolph's career is rescued by an injection of fund money in 1924-25. His Messenger magazine is in decline. It's having a great deal of difficulty, and he reaches out to the fund and is lifted up at a crucial moment for his career. But come the 1930s, all of these projects, from Randolph to the NAACP to the ACLU's free speech projects to the news syndication services and the industrial unions, they've run to the end of their funding source, but they've also run into the moment of opportunity for making the world that they'd hoped to bring into being. The Great Depression scrambles American politics. It scrambles the basic structure of American society, and it creates an opportunity for the people at Brookwood Labor College to go out into the world and remake it. The reason Brookwood closes in 1937 is that its instructors and its students do not want to be in Katona, New York, doing labor theory. They want to be in Detroit and Flint and Pittsburgh, and they want to be in Toledo. This is Toledo, rubber strikes in 1935, 36, 37. The instructors from Brookwood are, by the dozens, key labor organizers, theorists, strategists in the most important New Deal strikes. This is the Flint sit-down strike, famously in the winter of 36, 37. The sit-down strike is a Brookwood strategy, a strategy designed by people like the Reuther brothers, who are key early figures at the United Auto Workers. This is Walter Reuther on the left, as you see him. This is right after he's been beat up on the famous overpass at the River Rouge plant at Ford a few years later. The Reuther brothers are all part of the extended Brookwood world. Walter Reuther's two brothers are educated and instructors at Brookwood. Walter almost becomes an instructor at Brookwood, but it's 1937 and it's time to go. And so he and his brothers end up back in Detroit and Flint. The world of the fund hits the New Deal, the moment of depression, as an opportunity to remake the world, as an opportunity to put in practice some of the things that it had been designing behind the scenes. I want to end with two of the fund's late projects. One is the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. That picture is here. The New Deal does an array of things for Black America, some of them really quite terrible. Agricultural Adjustment Act produces subsidies for farmers in the American South. This produces not subsidies for black sharecroppers, but rather evictions for black sharecroppers, as white planters evict them in order to keep the subsidies for themselves. So this is a form of New Deal. It's a New Deal compromise that's part of the tragic compromise that people like Ira Katz-Nelson have studied and described, in which the New Deal produces a compromise for white America at the expense of black America. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union is organized by socialists and financed by some of the last money in the middle of the 30s of the Garland Fund to organize black and white sharecroppers. And you can see this photograph is intentionally mixed race. It's part of a strategy of the STFU to have all of its iconography be mixed race as a way to manage the politics of the moment. And the fund invests deeply in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union to the extent that it can, given its post-crash resources. I want to say a word about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union to flag something that I haven't flagged here, but is important, and I'd be happy to talk more about it, which is the fund is not just a space of cooperation and synthesis among labor and civil rights and civil liberties projects. It's also a site for real battles. It shouldn't surprise anyone here or anywhere that the American left and liberals and leftists are engaged in huge fighting and infighting and bickering across, well, just about anything that they do. And the fund is a site for much of that infighting and bickering. And during the course of the fund's work, it has to manage the problem of the American Communist Party. Maybe I gave away my take when I said the problem of the American Communist Party. I suggested to you, and I showed you the images of the fund's founding board, that part of the project of Roger Baldwin, at least at the outset, was to have one member of the Communist Party, but then he added only one and only one. And Baldwin in the early 20s is already aware that one of the things that the Communist Party did was bore from within. That was the iconic phrase of the era, bore from within liberal organizations to take them over. And Baldwin, at least in that moment, was committed to the idea that he didn't want that to happen to the Garland Fund. So one of the things that comes out of the Garland Fund archives is that it is an amazing quintessential case study of the project of boring from within. William Z. Foster is the first communist on the board in the early 1920s, and Foster is in fact the architect of the American strategy of boring from within. All of his fellow board members understand that they are funding, when they make fund grants to Communist Party projects, they're funding boring from within projects at other organizations. What they didn't realize was that Foster was boring from within the Garland Fund from the whole time. And so Foster quietly adds non-public Communist Party members to the board at each opportunity, such that by 1929, 1930, those are key years, you already know, because the NAACP grants that are before the board then. By 1929, 1930, Foster's project has almost come to fruition. He controls by 1930 exactly half of the board, And the NAACP grant is a grant made in a huge battle between the center-left, the Industrial Democrat project of the board, Sidney Hillman, James Weldon Johnson on the one hand, against the communist contingent on the other, which says this anti-Jim Crow litigation project of yours is a terrible idea. The better idea is to stand up the Communist Party's relatively new idea, but an idea that has deep roots in Black American political thought, which is to say that Black America should look for sovereignty, should look for self-determination in the Black Belt. And so the Communist Party, starting in 1928, has the idea that a Black Belt, a sickle-shaped region from Virginia, south and west, should be a self-determining Black country. And that fight happens. That fight that is a fight between liberal civil rights advocates and communist Black emancipation advocates, that fight happens on at the table at the Garland Fund Board in 1929, 1930, and comes down to the climactic story is a story of parliamentary maneuvering in the fund at the board. It's actually true that a climactic story can be parliamentary maneuvering. I think it's not a contradiction in terms, although I'll let you be the judge. The reason I raised the Southern Tenant Farmers Union as the occasion for making reference to this particular piece of this story is that the STFU, like any number of left organizations at the time, is riven by this same conflict. The founder of the STFU, a man named H.L. Mitchell, is an assassination attempt victim at the hands of a slightly deranged member of the party at a labor college in Arkansas. There are other pieces of the New Deal, too, ones that actually in some ways in the literature right now are less attended to. I described to you the STFU as arising out of the tragic compromise at the expense of Black Americans in the New Deal. A. Philip Randolph, part of the world of the fund all the way through, finds in the New Deal and the Wagner Act the moment in which, finally, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters campaign can succeed. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters have failed across the course of a decade to get the Pullman Company to come to the table, to recognize them as a union and engage in collective bargaining. But when the United States Supreme Court, in the Great Switch of 1937, upholds the new Wagner Act as constitutional under the Commerce Clause, this finally brings the Pullman Car Company to the table, leads them to recognize Randolph's union, and produces a collective bargaining agreement that Randolph had been fighting for in the world of the fund since 1925. Roger Baldwin helps to wind down this foundation in 1941. The money is mostly gone. Charles Garland, the donor, is now middle-aged, still confused, and in some part captured and destroyed by his alliances with the Communist Party. When the Nazi-Soviet pact is announced in 1939, Charles Garland has a breakdown. He loses his mind. He's hospitalized for a month. He's then sent to an institution in Florida where he's one of the first American recipients of electroshock therapy. It was not a good thing to be one of the first recipients of electroshock therapy, and I managed to talk to his youngest son, who was still alive a decade ago, has since passed. And his youngest son described his father as an empty person for almost all of the younger son's life, to the extent that he knew him. But when Baldwin winds down the fund in 1941, the world that the Garland Fund had represented, a kind of extended popular front of left and liberal organizations, had really started to collapse. It was a world that was starting to turn into a second Red Scare, a world that was dividing the left and dividing liberals from the communists and socialists who had been part of their extended popular front cooperation. Nonetheless, that world put into place by the movements around the Garland Fund helped to build some of the central institutions of the liberal constitution of the middle of the 20th century, with all of their warts and all of their tragic flaws. A world in which the Supreme Court, for the first time in American history, recognized the speech rights of dissenting people with dissenting political views. A world in which Jim Crow as a formal legal structure was dismantled, an astonishing accomplishment given the way it was in which it was embedded in the American political structure, an accomplishment that leads Du Bois in 1954 to look back and say that he's seen the impossible happen. And it's a world in which American labor unions represented one-third of workers in the private sector. That's the accomplishment of the middle of the 20th century. And those three major projects come out of the social formations and social mobilizations which met around the table of the Garland Fund during the course of the 1920s. Each of those social formations and the coalition that came out of them, their configuration as the New Deal civil rights synthesis, of course, are in collapse in the 2020s. We look out at a world in which each one of those things is in crisis, and the world that they produced together in complicated, oftentimes tense conversation is in collapse. And I think it's, maybe I'll end by engaging in some just rank speculation, if you'll forgive me, some rank speculation about what it is that's produced the collapse of those worlds. The center of the Garland Fund's world was the Industrial Union. It was a way of connecting tens of millions of Americans, tens of millions of working class and middle class Americans to institutions that were central to the American economy. Things like the Communications Project of free speech and the production of democratic discourse, and things like civil rights were attendant to that capitalism reformation project that Sidney Hillman, Brookwood Labor College, and A.J. Muste helped to produce. We here in the early stages of the 21st century still, are in a world in which the industrial union no longer is adequate to the kind of capitalism that we see around us. It's no longer matched in its particular architecture and design to the way in which the economy works. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the political configuration, the constitutional configuration organized around the Garland Fund's world should also be in collapse. There are other features of it too. There are all sorts of ways in which features like free speech and civil rights were sustained by an extended Cold War world, a Cold War world that is now no longer part of our politics, one that we've probably been distracted from the effects of the end of the Cold War by things like 9/11 that delayed the arrival of the end of the Cold War as part of the geopolitical structure. But the basic configurations that the Garland Fund produced strategies to manage are gone. And our task, one that is not going especially well for the descendants of these folks, is to design institutions matched to the economic and social landscape in which we find ourselves today. I will end on the following thought. It is the American right that is doing a better job of identifying formations that match the world in which we find ourselves. America First is an effort to identify a unit, a political unit that works for the industrial economic capitalist stage in which we find ourselves. It produces an economic project, it identifies the form of solidarity, and it engages electoral politics with a kind of real possibility of success. One last word, which is nothing that the Garland Fund does is about electoral politics at all. I think this is kind of an interesting feature. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are both in the 1920s unavailable to these people, and actually they're not especially interested because they're convinced that the deep changes, the transformed social formations and institutions that will sustain a political coalition won't run through parties. They will instead run through social movements and social mobilizations and economic structures like industrial democracy. So our project in the 21st century, I think, is to try desperately to identify new formations that will be adequate to that same task that was taken on a century ago. Thank you very much.
So you began your amazing talk by giving us kind of a litany of similarities between the moment in which your historical actors find themselves in the 1910s, roughly, and where we are today. And you ended by giving us sort of a fascinating glimpse at what you think is necessary to the current moment. And I guess I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about some of the lessons that we might draw from your story, both from the similarities to the present day and also maybe some of the differences. And I'm curious to hear more.
Great. Well, there's a way in which the lessons here are not concrete; they're very abstract, which I apologize for. It's not. There's no blueprint here. But the idea is that there are three elements that are just crucial to the production of a decent politics. And those are an economic piece that connects people to the possibility of prosperity. This is Hillman's genius as a labor organizer. Hillman transitions. I hope this is a controversial idea, actually, in this group. Hillman transitions the labor project away from class war to class collaboration with capital to create prosperity for his members. He wants rich union members. He wants his people to have money. He thinks that's what they want. He thinks he can organize them to become middle-class Americans and enjoy the benefits of mass production capitalism. But he wants them to have a say, and he's sure that if they don't have a say, then the prosperity will quickly be stripped from them. So there's an economic piece. There's a cross-difference piece. That is to say, we live in a world of many different kinds of people, ethnicities, religions, races, and unless you can organize a political unit across those differences, it will be a failure. And then last, there's a communications piece. Unless you can produce a discourse that can carry the messaging, carry the truths necessary to have a democratic republic, then it will fail too. But those are three very abstract pieces. I've in some sense just gestured at three crises you already knew existed. You already knew these crises existed. All I've told you really is that a century ago, a group of really creative, thoughtful people you also already knew existed, but didn't know came together around this particular table. I've told you that a century ago, some really creative people had some really interesting solutions to their versions. There are different versions of our problem. Of course, there are differences too. I mean, Warren Harding, he's no Donald Trump, right? That is to say, he is not a successful demagogue who's able to transform a politics. I mean, he's a mediocre Ohio politician who stumbles into the position that he finds himself in, and dies soon enough. So there are differences. There are differences.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you one more question before I open it up. As someone who also spent a long time on the book, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what changed about your conception of the project between, I think you said 2014 roughly, and when you completed the book, I assume about a year or so ago.
Yes, what changed in my thinking about the book? I encountered the Garland Fund, as lots of people in my field will have. I know all the legal historians in this room at all encountered the Garland Fund as part of their graduate school reading, because you do. You have to read Richard Kluger on simple justice. You have to read Mark Tushnet on the NAACP's litigation campaign. And when you do, you see this Garland Fund outfit, this sort of strange first chapter of these books. And so I, in beginning the project, thought that I was writing a slightly expanded version, a slightly wider angle lens of the first chapters of those books. And one of the reasons it took forever to figure it out is actually this one more slide. This slide. This is what took me forever to figure it out. It's going to be hard to read from where you are, but the NAACP litigation campaign is listed in the middle on the left. It's the yellow slice. So here was my problem, Serena. Here's my problem. I was going to write a narrative about an organization organized around this campaign, and it's like 4% of what it did. That's not a promising beginning for a story. So I had to figure out what animated these two huge pieces of pie over here. That's periodicals and publications, and it's workers' education. So the talk that I just gave is the product of trying to come to terms with this pie chart and to figure out how it is that we've come to narrate this foundation's experience around the NAACP project, which was a tiny piece of what it did. Now, this is slightly misleading, because the crash keeps the foundation from giving all of the money to the NAACP that had been approved for the NAACP. So this reflects the fact that the crash prevents them from making good on big grants that they made. There's a moment in the summer of '29 when Johnson and Du Bois think they can get $350,000 for their campaign from the foundation, because the foundation is just making money hand over fist in the first half of 1929. By October, they're down to $100,000, which is what the grant ends up being approved for. So this was the big challenge. And maybe I'll end with a thank you to the archivists of the great American research libraries around America, because they helped me figure this out. I mean, it's archivists at places like the Beinecke Library at Yale, which is convenient to me. I'm grateful for them because it's across the street. But the archivists at Wayne State University in Detroit, well, that's a great archive. And that's a place that understands the connection between civil rights efforts and labor efforts. The archivists at the Clements Center, Clements is SMU, at the University of Texas at Austin, it actually has the second and third best Garland Fund collection in America. The Garland Fund's papers are at the New York Public Library. That was part of Bolden's project, actually. There's a whole tax exemption piece that we haven't talked about. They have to maintain their tax exemption, so the papers are all public. So the archivists of America help me make sense of this